Hi everyone and welcome back to my booktube channel, Lisa in Bookland. Today I'm here to bring you an individual book review of an absolutely brilliant book that I read for the Irish Readathon this month, and that is The Ballad of Lord Edward and Citizen Small by Neil Jordan. I only knew Neil Jordan as the director of the Michael Collins film, but apparently he writes books as well, and this isn't his only book, and yeah, I just thought it was absolutely brilliant, so I'll definitely be checking out more of his books and his films, because I think Michael Collins is the only one I've seen. And yes, I read this in about 2 days. So this book was published in 2021 and it was actually longlisted for the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction, I believe, but not shortlisted, which was robbed in my opinion. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. The background to this book, I suppose, the book is set in like the 1780s, 1790s. It follows two characters, Lord Edward Fitzgerald and Tony Small. Lord Edward Fitzgerald is a very well-known figure in Irish history. He was of the Protestant ascendancy. He's most well known within Ireland, at least, for his involvement in the 1798 United Irishman rebellion, which is very much kind of a secular rebellion to gain independence from Britain based on kind of the ideals of the French and American revolutions. It's not an area of history I have read an awful lot about, and I don't always think it's the next hole that I'm going to fall into because it's really so interesting. I went to a talk about Wolfe Tone, who was another figure in that rebellion recently, and just why haven't I spent more time on this? And I'm so interested in the Napoleonic Wars. But anyways, that is a complete. Let me get back to what I was talking about. Anyways, Lord Edward Fitzgerald, as I said, he was the son of the Duke of Leinster, which is a very important family in Ireland. Their family seat was Carton House in County Kildare, and their townhouse in Dublin was actually Leinster House, which I never made that connection before. Leinster House is where the Irish government sits at the moment. So, yeah, just. Can't believe I never thought of that before. But anyways, the book starts off in the American War of Independence, when Lord Edward was a lieutenant in the British Army, and he's very badly wounded at one of the battles, and he ends up being rescued by this escaped slave called Tony Small, who essentially nurses him back to health, and out of gratitude Lord Edward brings him with him when he ends up going back to Britain and eventually Ireland. But what's interesting about the book really is it's told from Tony's perspective, and yeah, it just tells the story of that, I suppose, from their initial meeting up to 1798 and the events after it. Yeah, so I suppose I have a couple of different headers to talk about the book under. The first is the format. So it's called The Ballad of Lord Edward and Citizen Small, and instead of being broken up into sections, it's broken into verses. Now, it's not a novel that's written in verse or anything, just instead of sections it's called first verse, second verse, and there's also a chorus at the end, and that's such a fun and apt choice, I suppose. Much of our folk memory of 1798 is formed by very famous ballads that came out of that rebellion, such as On Shan Van Vucht is mentioned here, The Croppy Boy, Bula Vogues, The Rising of the Moon. They're all such famous ballads, so yeah, it's really big part of the history of that rebellion. So I just really liked that. I thought it was really interesting. And then each verse is broken into like smaller chapters, which they're kind of nice small chapters, so you really race through it. It looks like a big book, but because I suppose I have it in hardback, it's only 340 pages, I think. So yeah, quite small. But I also really liked about it being a ballad. It was always really conscious that it was being told in the future, and that like the narrative knows future events. So right from the very start, you know that Lord Edward has been betrayed and is now presumably executed for treason. There's also another really striking example where you meet these two brothers, and yeah, it just mentions kind of what happens to them, and yeah, I think that's kind of a ballad as well, you know. So yeah, I just really like that. Next, I suppose, Tony's narrative. So it is brilliant that this is told from Tony's perspective. Obviously somebody that didn't really get a voice in history. He really was a real figure, and he really did rescue Lord Edward. Obviously not an awful lot is known about him past that. I think there's one letter that survives that he wrote to Lord Edward's mother, which is kind of what maybe sparked the idea for this book, but the author obviously had to extrapolate a lot, and I thought it was just done really well. Apart from Tony being a great character in his own right, I just really liked that way of approaching a historical fiction book about such a big larger than life historical figure, maybe, because sometimes I think, you know, when you're reading, say, especially from like a first person narrative of a real historical figure, you're too close or something, or it just doesn't feel genuine, or like there's too much doubt about like, oh, did they actually think that, or what were they actually, did they actually act like that? Whereas when you're being told from a third perspective, it really kind of keeps that distance, and I think it makes it way more authentic. So you still get kind of an idea of their personality, but obviously there's a lot of events that Tony doesn't see or doesn't invited to, which I suppose lets Lord Edward retain his kind of mythological status almost, while still seeming like a human character in the book. However, like Tony absolutely does have a story in his own right. Really, like, I don't kind of want to give everything away, but he kind of is very confused about his origins, and some things have been told to him that aren't necessarily true, and I'm just trying to root through that and like how he feels when some things are revealed. He has his own interests obviously in relationship with Lord Edward's family. It's kind of interesting dynamic, I suppose, because they're grateful that he saved them obviously, and Lord Edward tries his best to elevate him as much as he can sometimes when he doesn't forget about him, but obviously Tony is limited by being a person of colour in the late 18th century in Ireland. But yeah, the way he does kind of navigate through both those difficulties, and yeah, just because of being Lord Edward's saviour, he's kind of given status which wouldn't usually be afforded to him even without taking account of his colour, and just when he meets like other servants, he's kind of elevated above them and he's allowed to do some things that they aren't, like go riding, or he has like servants of his own, and just watching him kind of navigate that world I just thought was really, really interesting. And I'm sure there were many characters like that in history that had kind of a middle ground that we just don't know an awful lot about, so yeah, I just really thought, I just really enjoyed that part. However, he does never ever forget his past as a slave, and that often comes up, and it just filters how he sees things, I suppose, like the white boys. I just thought it was really good. The final aspect I'm going to talk about in this book is the depiction of late 18th century Ireland. I just thought it was done so brilliantly, as I suppose would be expected from a film director. I just loved the depiction of Ireland before the Union. So the Act of Union with Great Britain came about in 1801 more or less as a direct consequence of the 1798 rebellion, so it was just really interesting to see in Ireland, which still had its own parliament, and I suppose where the landed gentry were still quite important and maybe not so much absenteeism around. Not that it was a perfect place by any stretch of the imagination, but it just was really interesting. It's not something that I've read an awful lot of fiction books about. Often they tend to be like set later. Just all the elements were there, from like the society in Dublin. There was like as well as the season in London, there was the season in Dublin at Dublin Castle. Just the big houses, like I mentioned, Carton House. At the other side of society, all the agrarian unrest with the white boys, and of course the United Irishman and their ideas, which are so interesting. It was like a secret society, cross religion, it was very secular. Yeah, it's something obviously Lord Edward becomes involved in, but yeah, I just thought it was depicted brilliantly, and just kind of the reasons why 1798 failed and all that, and just like other small things like the packet ship between Dublin and Holyhead, all the little details were there. And one brilliant aspect when to get to London is the London theatres, which are amazingly depicted in this book, but I'll talk about that in a second. The book being from Tony's perspective was brilliant because I never really thought about before, servants that were attached to one member of the household, like Tony. They kind of really, I suppose, like every other servant, they have very little control over their own destiny, but also where they'll go. Like when he leaves one house, like when he leaves the London house or when he leaves the Dublin house or whatever, he never knows when he'll go back again. And obviously he has friends among all the servants there, and he just doesn't know if he'll ever see them again, which I just thought was kind of sad and just never something I'd thought about before. There were a lot of other servants that were really memorable as well, especially Cecil, who was one of the servants in the London house, who just jumped off the page. So yeah, the theatre, it's just the star of this book really. So Lord Edward goes to the theatre with his family or friends, but then Tony goes with them as a groom for the carriage along with Cecil, but they can actually run into the theatre and go way up to the cheap seats and see the same play, obviously from way in the distance while it's going on, but they always have to leave before the end of the play so they can be out of the carriage before Lord Edward and his cronies come out. But I never thought about it before. It was so brilliantly done. So the first play they go to see in the book is The Tempest by William Shakespeare, which isn't a play that I have familiarity with at all, but though this book really made me want to read it. Yeah, suffice to say that Tony really identifies with one of the characters, and maybe if you know the play you'll be able to tell which one, but he can't see the end because as I said, they have to rush out, and that really, I suppose, hangs over him, and he just is asking everybody to know what's the end or what do you think's happened, and they maybe don't care sometimes. So yeah, I just thought that was really good. So a famous playwright of the day, Richard Brinsley Sheridan, who's an Irish playwright, actually does play a major part in this book. But yeah, suffice to say, I have no shortage of inspirations for plays that I could read for Jane Austen July. But yeah, I can't really describe enough kind of how well the theatre scene in London was depicted in this book. I could just imagine Drury Lane packed to bursting and all the crowd roaring and jeering and reacting to the play. It was just brilliant. And another at one stage in this book actually as well, Tony ends up seeing Robinson Crusoe as a play and also reading the book, and how he reacts to that. Again, obviously he there's a character in that he could identify strongly with. Yeah, if you're at all interested in 18th century society, I would highly recommend this book. But yeah, in conclusion, I suppose just a wonderful book. It was really well written. Neil Jordan, I can't wait to read more by him. I'll definitely be on the eye out. I can't believe that I've never heard him mentioned before as an author. Apparently this is his 7th book. Such snappy dialogue and such a memorable character in Tony, and just such a great way to give voice to somebody who history has forgotten, but also the supporting characters just jump off the page and are so brilliantly depicted. From, as I said, the servants. Maybe I dwelled on the servants a bit much, but also like Lord Edward's family and the women in his life. Oh, there's such a great way that Tony describes how he knows when Lord Edward is in love or not in love. But yeah, I won't spoil anything. I just really think you should experience this book for yourself. But yeah, I've nothing more to say really. Just go out and read this book, and yeah, please let me know if you've read it already or read any of Neil Jordan's other books. So yeah, thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday for my next booktube video.